Thank you guys for having me today. Thank you so much to the CFO Leadership Council. Again, my name is Hannah Smolinski. I am a CPA in Washington State and the owner and founder of Clara CFO Group. We focus most of our efforts on helping small businesses with strategic financial information that maybe they're not getting from their bookkeeper or tax accountant. But really over the last 8 months, we've really been focused really heavily on PPP, helping people get the loan, helping people use the loan appropriately, and then obviously now applying for forgiveness. So that's what we're gonna be chatting about today. And I just want to say a quick thank you to Upside for sponsoring this session. So actually, we're going to go ahead and hopefully we have everybody in the session because we're going to go ahead and launch our first polling question. I think I am seeing some people who are still coming in, so if maybe we can leave that a little bit longer up. But really, we want to start with just saying, what are our key concerns? What are our key concerns when thinking about PPP loan forgiveness? So if you could let us know that, I think it would be kind of interesting. I'm going to kind of keep an eye, and I know some people are still coming in. But while people are coming in and answering that polling question, I want to just go ahead and say, well, let's go back. Let's go back to when the CARES Act first came out and this rule was put into place. So PPP stands for Paycheck Protection Program. And we just want to go back and say, well, what was the point? What was the whole point of the PPP? And the whole point was to help employees stay employed. I think when the CARES Act came out, they knew that businesses were going to need to be, well, with coronavirus, businesses were going to start shutting down. And the government said, hey, we need to keep people off unemployment as much as possible. So let's help out small businesses. Let's keep them running and let's go ahead and provide this funding. Now, I think it's good to keep that in mind because the SBA and the Treasury have given us tons of guidance after the original CARES Act. However, there's still some gaps, and sometimes we need to apply logic to specific situations. So I think it's always good to keep that in mind as we're going through your unique situation. You know, does this help employees stay employed? And I think that'll help us apply guidance a little bit better. And that's really been helping a lot of small businesses along the way. The other thing that I want to just remind everybody is that the whole funds are supposed to be used mostly for payroll costs. However, they do allow this ability to have certain other non-payroll costs. Now, we do this in a 60-40 split. You need to have at least 60% of the money spent on payroll costs, and that key term, at least, and then not more than 40% of the money to be spent on other non-payroll costs. So we're going to just go over some of the high levels of those costs here right now. Well, let's talk real quick, just reviewing the polls. I think a lot of people are concerned about not achieving maximum forgiveness. And then, yeah, just filling out the applications. Those are the two top concerns, and we will definitely talk about some of that here. All right, let me get to my next slide here. All right, so what counts as payroll cost? I think it's important for us to go over this because sometimes we forget everything that can be included. So this can help you maximize your forgiveness. So the first thing is cash compensation. So cash compensation can be in the form of salaries, hourly wages. It can be in the form of tips. If you've had a restaurant that you paid people tips, even though nobody was actually working and didn't receive them from customers, but you were kind of coming up with, kind of a compensation package for the people you were trying to keep on board. This can also be paid leave. So let's say you were paying maternity leave or you're paying sick leave. Those can be included in cash compensation. You can also include employer retirement contributions, as well as employer healthcare contributions and employer state and local taxes. Okay. Now let's also just touch base on like what can't be included on payroll costs, because this is half the battle, right? So cash compensation over $100,000 in an annualized salary cannot be included for anybody, no matter if they're an employee or an owner or anything. So you have to cap everybody at $100,000 of cash compensation. Now you can still have somebody at $100,000 of cash compensation and still add on retirement and healthcare and other taxes. But It's important to keep that in mind. The other thing that's not included and not allowable under the PPP payroll costs is federal payroll taxes. We can include state and local, but not federal. And then workers' compensation insurance has not been included as well. For whatever reason, they don't want that included. And then certain fringe benefits that you might have for your employees, let's say maybe an FSA contributions, or maybe some fringe life insurance or additional disability or things like that. We cannot include those costs either. I think really the SBA was trying to say, well, let's focus on like the core. Let's focus on cash compensation. Let's focus on taxes that have to be paid. And obviously you can't stop paying your healthcare, or that would cause a lot of problems. So they were trying to kind of, I think, focus it down to like the key core benefits. Now, I think it's important to remember right now that it's okay to use 100% of your loan on payroll costs. If you were in a situation that maybe you thought, a lot of us got our loans early on in the process, and we thought we only had 8 weeks to use the money, but then it got expanded to 24 weeks. What I'm seeing, a lot of clients and a lot of people I'm talking to are saying, well, actually I have enough payroll cost to, prove that I spent all of the money on payroll. And that is totally okay. You can use 100% of your PPP loan for payroll costs. You don't have to include any non-payroll costs. But let's review. If you do need to include non-payroll costs, let's go over those real quick. So this would be, let's see here. So if there's 3 basic things that you can spend your money on outside of payroll. Mortgage interest, and this can be on personal or real property, basically any loan that is secured. And then this you can use it for rent or lease payments, but the rent or the lease needs to have been in place before February 15th of 2020. As well as utilities, same thing. If the utilities were in place before February 15th, 2020, then they can be allowed as a non-payroll cost. Now, this is kind of a moment where I want to say, hey, remember that the intention of the rule was to keep employees employed, but it was also meant to just maintain status quo. This loan was not meant to fuel growth efforts. So if you're going out and renting new spaces, adding new utilities to your P&L, then the SBA is not going to like that, and they don't want that to be included in your PPP funds. Okay, so make sure that when you're going to prove these costs, that you also have some proof showing that these items, these expenses were in place before February 15th of this year. Okay. And what I've been liking to do for when people are going to apply for forgiveness is I kind of have been recommending for people to choose what's the best and easiest way to document these expenses. So you might have, let's say you got $1 million loan, you might have $900,000 of payroll costs that you can include. So you're trying to come up with another $100,000 of expenses, but maybe just 2 or 3 or 4 months of rent will fill in those expenses. I'm saying, well, if it's easy to document the rent and show those expenses, it might be more advantageous for you, an easier process and an easier application to review. You don't necessarily want to have to go and pull every single tiny utility bill and then try to include it in that 100,000. So you can kind of pick and choose which expenses you want to kind of present to the bank for forgiveness, okay? The next slide here. So let's review real quick a timeline. So I think we're going to go ahead and launch another polling question. And that question is, when do you think you're going to start your PPP loan application? So let's go over like the timeline of the PPP application, maybe when you got your funds, and then kind of what it looks like through to forgiveness. So the date you got your money is called the date of disbursement. And then from there, you either can choose an 8-week or a 24-week covered period. If you got your loan before June 5th, when the Flexibility Act was passed, then you have this option to select either option, 8 weeks or 24 weeks. If you got it after June 5th, they're all 24 weeks. You don't really get to choose. And this can be advantageous for some people to use the 8-week period over the 24-week period, but this is basically up to you. And this will be kind of depending on your operations and really what's happened in your business. Some people got their money at the very beginning of the time and they spent all of their money within the 8 weeks like they were told. And then June 5th rolled around and then they were like, well, I don't have any more money to spend, so I'm going to go ahead and try to apply for forgiveness using that 8-week covered period. But after your covered period, whichever way you go, you have up to 10 months to start the application process. And I'm seeing the results of the polls coming in, and most people are actually saying we're starting it now. 77% so far are saying we're starting it now or likely in Q1 of 2021. I think that from what I've seen, that's kind of what I've been recommending clients to do as well, because the further we get away from this money that we've actually spent, sometimes it's the hardest to document, right? So we want to go ahead and try to make sure we're at least gathering that information. We might hold on to it a little bit and then actually submit it to the bank, maybe more strategically, but going ahead and gathering all of this right now is absolutely a fantastic idea. All right. And then once you apply for forgiveness, we're going to go down to the second timeline down here. I want to kind of walk through what the process will be for you before you get a determination on your loan. So from the date of the forgiveness application, the bank has 60 days to review your application and then send it to the SBA. 60 days is their max. They're not supposed to hold onto it for any longer than that. And the same, once the SBA gets it, they have 90 days to review it and make a forgiveness determination. So this, we are looking at well into 2021. If you haven't applied for forgiveness already, we're looking well into 2021 before we get forgiveness answers on exactly how much is going to be forgiven. And at that point in time, once the funds come in from the SBA, the SBA will fund your bank to clear off your loan to if 100% or however much you get forgiven. And if you don't get forgiven the full amount, that is the point that payments start. You don't have to be making any payments until you get that forgiveness determination. Now, the one caveat of that would be is if you wait past 10 months after the end of your covered period, if you wait past 10 months to apply for forgiveness, you might have to go ahead and start repaying your loan until you do apply for forgiveness. All right. Okay, so we're going to go into trying to just go over some common pitfalls that we're seeing. And with the PPP, there have been many, and I just kind of wanted to go through the top things that I'm seeing as I'm helping people through the forgiveness process. And really, this is also, a lot of these have come up because additional guidance has been coming out that maybe we didn't know about when we first applied for the loans. So the biggest one I'm seeing people trip up right now is the rules around owner compensation. So owners actually need to be treated differently, even if they're owner employees and they're paid on payroll, just like all the other employees. Owners are treated differently than regular employees. And this guidance came out, I think, after really the PPP money was starting to flow and questions started coming in to say, hey, can I give my managers or can I give my owners bonuses? Is this a possibility? Can I just use all of this as bonuses to pay owners because they had to let all their employees go? And the big answer was no, you can't do that. This was not the point of the PPP money. Remember, it was to keep employees employed. So really, they came up with these rules to help avoid owner windfalls. That's not the point of this money. So, but they do say, hey, yeah, obviously we want owners still need to be compensated. They still need to get paid. So let's include them in PPP, but we're going to put some limits on it. Okay, so this is actually, we're going to launch our next polling question because one of the ways they're determining this owner compensation is based on your tax status. So we're going to go ahead and launch that. We're going to say, like, what is your entity type right now? So if you can plug that in, that would be great. And so when we're looking at owner compensation, we actually have to go back to 2019. So if you were paying yourself, let's say you were paying yourself a salary in 2019, that's going to be used as the maximum limit of what you can claim on the PPP in 2020. Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of like S Corps and C Corps, which is kind of what I expected. A couple sole proprietors and partnerships. Okay. So when we're looking back for sole proprietors and partnerships, we're going to be looking at your 2019 tax returns to establish your basis of what you can claim as your compensation in 2020 under the PPP. And then for S Corps and C Corps, your owners should be on W-2 wage. You should have a W-2 wage. So you need to look at their W-2s from 2019 to use those as a maximum. All right. So what we're going to do there, we also have a cash compensation limit, same like we have with employees. Remember that nobody can get paid more than $100,000 in an annualized salary. Okay. So even if you paid yourself $200,000 last year, and then you paid yourself, $150,000 this year on W-2 wages, it doesn't really matter. You still have to cap last year's wages at $100,000. Okay. Now, the other thing that they're doing, which is kind of interesting. So if you took an 8-week covered period, you can take 8 weeks of pay for yourself as an owner. But if you take the 24-week covered period, unfortunately, as an owner, you don't get to take 24 weeks of compensation under the PPP. You can only take 2.5 months. Now, if you were an employee, you could take all 24 weeks of compensation, even if you were at $100,000. So that if you take $100,000 salary, you divide it by 52, you multiply it times 24, we're actually looking at $46,000 that you could claim under the PPP. But for owners, the maximum compensation we can have is $20,833. Okay, because that we can only take 2.5 months. Okay, this is another way to kind of prevent that windfall. Now, the kind of good news is that if you are maybe an S Corp or a C Corp and you own less than 5% of the entity, you can be treated as an employee. So that's kind of a little loophole that I'm not sure everybody knew about. So, okay, great. Let's move on to the next thing. There's been some confusion around forgiveness forms. So they first put out the forgiveness form 3508. And then a simplified version came out because everybody thought the first one was too complicated. And then they brought out just recently, kind of in the last month, the 3508S form. So now we have 3 forgiveness forms, which for whatever reason they decided was necessary, but it is getting consistently simplified. So maybe for those of you who might be sole proprietors or even partnerships, you might have gotten a loan under $50,000. And if that's the case, you can go ahead and use a 3508S form. If you have any loan under $50,000, you can use this 3508. And you really want to do it. Like there should be no reason to use any other form because this is a form that helps you not have to prove out any FTE reductions. So it definitely is simplified and it definitely helps you out. It does not mean that you don't have to document your expenses. You still have to do all of that. It does not mean it's blanket forgiveness on any loan under 50,000, but it is giving you sort of what I like to call blanket safe harbor on any employee reductions or any headcount reductions. I don't have a slide on the 3508S, but we're going to talk about the 3508EZ because I figured more of you would probably be in the EZ and then the full form. So I wanted to focus time there. So 3508EZ, can you use it? With this one, it's kind of a 2-part test. You go ahead and you say, well, did you reduce salaries or hourly wages by more than 25%? If your answer is no, then you can continue on. And then you can say, does A or B apply? Did you reduce employees or average paid hours between January 1 and the end of the covered period? If your answer is, did you not reduce? If you did not reduce, then you can use the easy form. Or if you got shut down by a government ordinance, something that was to help comply with health, social distancing and guidelines there. If you were not able to operate at the level that you were at pre-COVID, then you can also use this form. But these two really need to be coupled together. You can't just say, okay, B applies, but I actually did reduce our hourly or salary wages more than 25%. Okay. So you have to do both and. Okay. And we did have a polling question that came up. So we did have a couple people under 50,000, which is great. But yes, a lot of people in that kind of that medium size loan.
SBA loans who were giving $750,000 at risk. So I probably better maybe focus on it.
Oh. Okay, I couldn't really, I'm not sure if that was a question, but I couldn't really hear it. Okay. So kind of overall on the size of the loans, we're seeing a lot of people in this session today between 150 and 2 million. And that's probably where a lot of people are sitting. We do have a couple of people who have those higher than $2 million loans. So we're going to kind of touch on that in a little bit. So going down into the next form. So if you're not able to use the easy form, a lot of us probably won't, especially once you're starting to get these higher dollar value loans. What's happening is you have a lot more employees, right? If you have a $2 million PPP loan, that means that you had pretty high payroll costs, which also means you had a lot of employees, and the likelihood that we didn't have some employees leaving during this time is pretty low. So what we're trying to do now is we're trying to say, okay, we understand that keeping headcount will help us maximize our PPP forgiveness. So what I want to talk to you guys about first is ways that you can essentially achieve safe harbor to then not have to prove out all of the details of your FTE loss. Okay, because if these things happened, if these safe harbors happen for you, then you kind of skip some of the complicated parts of the 3508 form. So we're going to go over what those are. And the first two are really similar to the EZ form. Okay, so we did see the first one is that if you did not reduce your employees or average paid hours between January 1 and the end of cover period, if you didn't do that, you can check a box on the 3508 form, and it saves you from having to prove out all of your FTE calculations. The other would be shut down, if you were shut down, similar to what we talked about, due to a health ordinance. And then the third one would be if you restored your headcount. So if you let people go between February 15th and April 26th, because that's when the pandemic started and you were seeing the writing on the wall and you knew you had to kind of let some people go in order to preserve cash flow. And then you got a PPP loan after that. If you let people go during that time, but you restored them as of the date of the forgiveness application or December 31st, and I'm saying restored them as in the head count, it doesn't have to be the exact individual. If you did restore that head count, then this is also a way to achieve safe harbor. All right, now these are pretty specific instances and not everybody has been able to do that. So we're gonna go into what if none of those safe harbors apply? There's still some hope. You don't have to just take a reduction on FTE because you didn't reach these safe harbors, okay? Let's go. All right, so we have this thing now called FTE reduction exemptions. Okay, so the SBA understands that sometimes employment is outside of our control. I mean, we're doing our best to keep people on payroll, right? That's kind of the point of the money. But we also understand that we can't control employees. We can't control what they do. And we also can't control sometimes the hiring process. So here's some ways that if you need to go line by line through your FTE or through your employees and say, okay, this one left and here's why, this person left and here's why, you can achieve some exemptions. So you basically, they don't count essentially in your FTE reduction if they reach some of these points. So let's go through those. So let's say the first is that if you let somebody go and you made a good faith attempt to rehire that person and they refused, Also, refusal would be maybe non-responsive. So this happened a lot when employees were starting to go on, they were starting to go on unemployment. And especially when there was that extra $600 a week, a lot of people were offered jobs and not taking them because, and I'm sure that's probably ringing true with a lot of you guys right now, but they were not taking those jobs because it was too lucrative to stay on unemployment. So if you made a good faith attempt to rehire, but it was refused, then that's an exemption. You don't have to worry about that person, but you do need to document this. Okay. Now, similarly, if you let an employee go and you tried to rehire for that position and you were not able to find any qualified employees to fill that position, then that is also an exemption. This is really helpful. Like if you had, maybe a very technical position, somebody that really needed to reach, a certain level of requirement. We're not talking about like really low skilled labor. This could really be in like that high skilled labor industry. With this, you need to make sure that you actually made a good faith search to rehire. Okay. So this might look like you actually keep your, if you posted the job on Indeed or you put it on LinkedIn or whatever, wherever you had your job posting out there, you do want to include that in your documentation for these exemptions. The last kind of section would be reductions that were due to just kind of natural causes of employee fluctuation. So maybe you had to let somebody go because you had to have a disciplinary action for something that they did. That is okay if they were fired for cause, and the cause can't be because the pandemic hit and you didn't have business. It has to be something, some disciplinary action on that side. So if there was a good reason you would be letting them go regardless of the pandemic, then if that's properly documented, that can be exempt. Additionally, if they voluntarily resigned, took a new job, or if they just voluntarily resigned and went on unemployment, that might be a bad idea for them. But if they did that, that is not on you as the employer. That is on them to deal with the aftermath of that decision. And then also if they reduce their hours. So this happened a lot with individuals that may have been full-time, but then their kids stayed home from school and somebody decided that they needed to be home more and they needed to reduce their hours in order to do that. So they might have been a 1 FTE and they went down to a half FTE. If that's the case, you can include them as an exemption. The key here is to really document all of those fluctuations so that you have really good proof that you really did try. You really did try to keep your employees employed. All right. So those, I really do feel like those FTE exemptions can be really helpful, but I also want to kind of point out a couple other ways, and I don't want to say these are ways that you can maybe manipulate is not the right word, but optimize the 3508 forgiveness options to suit your situation best. Okay. So the 3508 does allow us some selections that we can choose to, and we can use these strategically to choose what's best for us in the more optimal position. So the first is that you can choose your look back period. So when we're comparing full-time employees or full-time equivalents, we look at the average over the covered period, and we can compare that to certain look back periods. We can look back and say January 1 to February 29th of this year, how many FTEs were in that period? Or we can say February 15th to, I believe it's June 30th of last year, how many FTEs were in that period. So this can be helpful for you. Let's say you were in a growth pattern between 2019 and 2020. Let's say you had 80 FTEs last year during the last year's look back period, but you grew to 120 at the beginning of 2020, but you had to reduce down to 100 during the covered period of your loan. So if that's the case, you could say, well, it doesn't actually help me. It looks like I reduced too much headcount if I compare it to January, but if I compare it to last year, it looks like I have way more FTEs. So I'm good. And so that's where one of the places that you can optimize that, that selection. The other way, another kind of helpful way to do this is, or a selection that you have two options for calculating how you look at your FTEs. You can either do a simple calculation, which is kind of what we would probably all think. We take average hours, we divide it by 40, because we use 40 as a full work week for the purposes of the PPP. And then you round it to the nearest 10th. So that would be your, so you might get, a 0.3, a 0.6, a 0.7 FTE. Now, the SBA has offered another option, and this has been helpful for a lot of people. You can use a simplified version that says, if you have a loan over, or if you have an employee who works over 40 hours on the regular, then they're 1 FTE. If they work under 40 hours on the regular, they're a half. Doesn't matter if they work 2 hours or they work 38 hours, but if they're always working under 40, they're a half FTE. Okay. So this can be used very strategically, because if you needed to restore employees, you could potentially restore them. If they're a half FTE, you could consider, okay, if they were a half FTE before, maybe they had 30 hours on the regular, but I don't necessarily need to give them 30 hours to still get my half FTE back. Okay. So they could maybe only have 5 or 10 hours on the regular on their schedule once they're restored. I also have on here the FTE reduction exemptions. That's the previous slide that we talked about, like going line by line through employees. That is really helpful for people, and it really will help you kind of reclaim a lot of dollars back on your PPP if you take the time to do that exercise. And then the last thing I want to just mention is that remember that you do have the option to opt in to 8 weeks. This is, most people are using the 24-week covered period because it was, an option, and okay, now we have longer time to spend the money. However, depending on what's been happening in your business, if your business had a slow decline across the rest of 2020, then maybe your FTE count is so reduced that you're not going to be able to achieve as much forgiveness as if you had just cut it off as of 8 weeks. So if you are concerned about that, and you did have that kind of lag after the original 8 weeks, you might want to consider just saying, okay, well, what would it look like if I did choose the 8-week period? And you might be able to achieve more forgiveness that way. Okay, and then just the kind of the last pitfall I'm really seeing is that people are maybe not documenting as much as they should. So this is where we need to document every single thing, especially on those FTE exemptions, and especially if you think you qualify for any safe harbors, you need to be able to prove it. Okay, so keep all of your documentation. Your bank will ask for very specific documentation. They'll ask for payroll reports and 941s and your state and local tax forms, and they'll ask for rent stuff, and they'll ask for your lease, and they'll ask for very specific documents. However, if you are claiming any FTE reductions, that you should be exempt from it, make sure that you keep all of that in a separate audit file, because you may not need to give it to the bank, but it doesn't mean you won't be asked for it at some point in time. Okay, so we want to go ahead and do that now, because we don't want to be trying to document this loan next year or 2 years from now or 3 years from now when the SBA audits start. Okay. So I think we all know that the PPP, there's still additional things coming out. There's still news now that we have a new administration coming into office. We're going to potentially be seeing other, who knows, we're potentially another stimulus package. It's all still up in the air. If another stimulus package does happen, it's very likely there will be some PPP provisions in there that might change a few things. So one thing that's kind of a hot topic for people right now is on the tax treatment and tax planning. So if you're probably all aware that the IRS has said that PPP expenses, whatever is forgiven, cannot be deductible on your taxes. So if that's the case, this is, posing a lot of challenges for tax planners, because we don't necessarily know if your loan's forgiven until the SBA tells us. So we are, in a little bit of a flux right now. A lot of CPAs are trying to churn right now. I know a lot of you are in the financial sector right now. So just keep your eye on this. A lot of us are also, kind of keeping an eye on the lobbyists who are trying to get these expenses to be deductible. So non-taxable income and deductible expenses. So TBD on that, but we are having to make some kind of difficult decisions right now with outcomes that we don't fully know. The other thing is that has been talked about and is still a potential is a blanket forgiveness for loans potentially under a certain dollar amount. It was basically, there's a push to have loans under $150,000 just blanket forgiven, where they wouldn't have to even like go through, proving any of these expenses. My hopes for that are kind of waning at this point, but it's still a potential. So it's something to keep an eye out. Definitely in a stimulus package, it could be bundled in there. So just keep an eye out for that. Now, for those of you who have loans of $2 million or higher, I want to make sure that you pay attention to this piece, because this form, the 3509 form, was just released last week, I believe. The 3509 form is going to be required for any borrower who has a loan over $2 million. And it's essentially a detailed questionnaire that helps you figure out, or helps the SBA understand what your liquidity, your access to liquidity was before the PPP, and then also kind of what happened with your business during the time your covered period. So definitely go and try to search that form right now if you haven't seen it yet, because there's a lot of questions in that are going to be helpful for you as you try to prove out, yes, we did actually need this money. Because when you all had to certify, taking a loan $2 million or higher, if you had access to other liquidity, they were trying to encourage you to return the funds. So this is now essentially kind of testing that assumption. So definitely check that out. But that was put out last week. So there's still things that are changing. We still need to keep an eye on, what's going on with the PPP. There's going to be a lot more, I'm sure. All right. So kind of, as you can tell, it is complex. We went through a lot of content just in this. And we're going to launch a polling question here. I think this one would be, do you feel that you have the resources to complete your PPP loan forgiveness application, or will you be seeking outside assistance? So I think we may have maybe missed a polling question, but this is another one that came through. But we're going to launch that here in a second. But yes, there's lots of guidance. Yes, it is complex, but there's a couple different options that you have. So you, as the leadership in your company, you can become the expert on this. You can be like me and educate yourself on how, and read the guidance and do that if it's worth it to you. You could have your internal team kind of take it over and run with it and learn everything they need to know. There are a lot of outside CPA firms and consulting firms offering forgiveness services. So that is something to consider. You do want to make sure, if you're using like an outside CPA firm, maybe your auditors per se, like you need to be careful that we're not like overstepping any independence issues there. So just make sure, if you are looking to have somebody's outside help, that you're doing the right, going through the right process there and signing the right engagement letters, because this would be a separate engagement. And then I just want to mention too, Upside Financial, who sponsored this presentation today, they have a loan forgiveness solution that kind of couples an online platform with personalized PPP experts on the back end. So you kind of get that consultation at a much more affordable price than the CPA firms are doing. So definitely something to check out. All right, so it sounds like a lot of you are kind of looking to just do the research on your own, which, I really go to the SBA, or actually the Treasury's website has a section that has basically all the guidance there for you. So you can click through, piecing through it can be a little bit challenging, but there's a lot of guidance there.